A millionaire is seconds from saying "I do" when his son storms in and shouts, "Stop the wedding." What he reveals about his father's fiancée leaves the entire ceremony in shock. Was she hiding a dark past? Or is the son out to ruin everything? One truth, one betrayal, and a family on the edge. What happens next will change their lives forever. You won't believe what really happened, and why. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn breeze carried the sweet scent of ripening grapes through the Vintessa estate as Christian Delaney stood before the full-length mirror in his private suite. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching the subtle pinstripes of his perfectly tailored black tuxedo. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his clean-shaven face couldn't hide the smile that kept tugging at his lips. "Hold still, sir," Jared said quietly, focused on fastening the platinum cufflinks. His assistant's steady hands made quick work of the delicate task. Christian pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, smoothing out the creases. His own handwriting stared back at him, words he'd rewritten dozens of times until they felt just right. "What do you think, Jared?" he asked, clearing his throat. "Should I run through them one more time?" "If it would help calm your nerves, sir," Jared replied with a gentle smile. Christian straightened his shoulders and began to read. "Vanessa, before you came into my life, I was a man who had everything and nothing at the same time." He paused, swallowing hard. "Success filled my bank account, but not my heart. Then you walked into that charity gala, and suddenly, my world had color again." Outside the suite, the estate staff hurried past with arms full of flowers and linens. The sound of their footsteps and urgent whispers filtered through the heavy wooden door, a reminder that his perfect moment was quickly approaching. Across the sprawling vineyard property, in a sun-filled bridal suite, decorated with trailing ivy and roses, Vanessa Steele reclined on a plush white chaise lounge. Her custom gown cascaded around her in waves of delicate lace, the fitted bodice highlighting her elegant figure. A crystal flute of champagne dangled from her perfectly manicured fingers as her bridesmaids fluttered around her like excited butterflies. "You look absolutely breathtaking," Molly gushed, adjusting the train of the dress. Tasha nodded enthusiastically. "Christian is going to cry when he sees you." "The dress is pure perfection," Grace added, carefully straightening Vanessa's veil. Vanessa's red lips curved into a satisfied smile. "Everything has to be perfect today," she said, her voice smooth as honey. Her eyes darted to her clutch purse sitting on a nearby table, and for just a moment, something like worry flickered across her face. When Aubrey, the wedding planner, swept into the room with her clipboard, Vanessa quickly reached for her clutch. "The guests are arriving," Aubrey announced, checking her watch. "We're right on schedule for the golden hour ceremony." While the bridesmaids weren't looking, Vanessa slipped out her phone and checked it quickly, her expression tightening for just a second before she tucked it away again. She took a long sip of champagne, and when she lowered the glass, her smile was back in place. Outside, the ceremony space had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale. Rows of white chairs lined either side of a natural aisle that wound through the vineyard. String lights were draped overhead, ready to twinkle as the sun began its descent. At the front, an elegant arch woven with white roses and trailing greenery stood framed by ancient grapevines. Wine barrels topped with massive flower arrangements marked the entrance to the aisle. The guests began to arrive, dressed in their finest. Women in flowing dresses and men in sharp suits found their seats as a string quartet played soft classical music. The melody drifted through the early evening air, mixing with the quiet murmur of conversation and occasional laughter. Christian emerged from the estate house with his groomsmen, looking every bit the successful businessman he was. His steps were steady as he made his way to the altar, though his hand occasionally brushed against his pocket where his vows were safely tucked away. He smiled and nodded at familiar faces in the crowd, business associates, old friends, family members. The setting sun cast everything in a warm, golden glow. The music shifted, and the guests rose to their feet. All heads turned toward the back of the aisle where Vanessa appeared, radiant in white. Her dress caught the light like morning frost, and her smile was dazzling as she began her graceful walk forward. The bridesmaids preceded her in flowing sage green dresses, but all eyes were on the bride. Christian's breath caught in his throat as he watched her approach. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, a second chance at happiness, at love, at family. The officiant stood ready beside him, prayer book in hand. Vanessa reached the altar, and Christian stepped forward to take her hands in his. The officiant smiled warmly at the gathered guests and began to speak. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." But before he could continue, a voice shot through the peaceful scene like a thunderbolt. "Stop the wedding!" The crowd gasped collectively, heads whipping around toward the sound. There, standing at the back of the aisle, was a young man with disheveled dark hair and wild eyes. His button-down shirt was wrinkled, his tie loose around his neck. Aidan Delaney, Christian's estranged son, stood breathing heavily, uninvited but undeterred. The string quartet's music screeched to a halt. 200 pairs of eyes stared in shock as Aidan began walking down the aisle, his footsteps heavy with purpose. The sound of rustling leaves filled the sudden silence at the Vintessa estate. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward the figure standing at the end of the aisle. Aidan Delaney's chest rose and fell rapidly, his dark hair windswept, and his blue dress shirt wrinkled as if he'd slept in it. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, which were fixed intently on the altar where his father stood. Christian's mouth fell open slightly, his practiced composure cracking as he stared at his son. His hands, still holding Vanessa's, trembled almost imperceptibly. Years of carefully maintained distance between them seemed to collapse in this single moment. "Aidan," Christian managed, his voice barely carrying across the stunned gathering. "What are you doing?" Instead of answering, Aidan strode forward, his dress shoes crunching against the gravel path between the rows of white chairs. His tie hung loose around his neck, swaying with each determined step. The string quartet had stopped playing, their instruments frozen mid-note. Vanessa's fingers tightened around Christian's hands. Her white lace veil caught the golden hour light, but her face had become a careful mask. "Dad," Aidan said, his voice rough with emotion, "you can't marry her." He pointed at Vanessa, his hand shaking. "She's not who you think she is." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Someone coughed nervously. The wedding planner, Aubrey, hovered at the edge of the altar, clutching her clipboard to her chest. "Son, please," Christian said, his entrepreneur's confidence wavering. "This isn't the time or place." "It's exactly the time and place," Aidan cut in. He pulled a folded stack of papers from his back pocket. Before Grandpa died, she was there, at his house, every day. Vanessa's perfectly made-up face paled slightly. "Christian, I don't know what he's talking about." "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Aidan snapped. His voice cracked with barely contained anger. "I found the letters, the bank statements, the changes to his will." More murmurs swept through the crowd. Several guests pulled out their phones, recording the scene unfolding before them. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the vineyard, the rows of grapevines standing like silent witnesses. 3 months before Grandpa died, Aidan continued, unfolding the papers with trembling hands. He changed his will. The family estate, our home for 4 generations, was suddenly left to a beneficiary named Elena Morrison. He looked directly at Vanessa. "That's one of your aliases, isn't it?" Vanessa's breath caught audibly. "These are ridiculous accusations," she said, but her voice wavered slightly. "Christian, please, make him stop." Christian stood frozen between them, his face a mixture of confusion and growing concern. The vows in his pocket felt heavy now, the carefully chosen words meaningless in the face of his son's allegations. "Dad," Aiden pleaded, his voice softening for a moment. She manipulated Grandpa when he was at his weakest. She visited him every day, brought him gifts, listened to his stories about Grandma. His voice grew stronger. Then she started suggesting changes to his will, small ones at first, then bigger ones. "That's enough," Vanessa's voice rang out, sharp and sudden. Tears welled in her eyes, catching the light. "These are horrible lies. I loved Edward like my own father." "You never even met him until 6 months before he died," Aiden shouted. He turned to his father, desperation clear in his features. "Dad, please. Look at the evidence. Look at the dates on these documents. Look at the signature on the will. It doesn't even match his normal signature." Christian finally released Vanessa's hands, taking a small step back. The space between them seemed to grow wider with each passing second. "I hired a private investigator," Aiden continued, his words tumbling out faster now. "Elena Morrison isn't the only name she's used. There's a pattern, Dad. 3 other elderly men in the past 5 years. All wealthy, all lonely, all manipulated into changing their wills before they died." Gasps rippled through the audience. Phones clicked and whirred, capturing every moment. The bridesmaids huddled together, exchanging worried glances. "Christian," Vanessa said, reaching for him. Tears streaked down her cheeks, leaving trails in her perfect makeup. "You know me. You know I would never—" "Show him the pictures," Aiden interrupted, pulling more papers from his pocket. "Show him how you looked different then. The brown hair, the glasses, the way you changed your appearance just enough that no one would connect Elena Morrison to Vanessa Steele." Christian's hands hung limply at his sides, his face ashen. The carefully constructed world he'd built around himself seemed to be crumbling with each revelation. "Son," he said quietly, finally looking directly at Aiden, "are you absolutely sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Aiden replied, his voice breaking. "I couldn't let her do this to you too, not after what she did to Grandpa." The silence that followed was deafening. The autumn breeze rustled through the vineyard, carrying the sweet scent of grapes and the bitter taste of exposed secrets. Vanessa looked between father and son, her composed facade cracking completely. Without warning, she turned and fled down the aisle, her white dress billowing behind her as tears streamed down her face. Her heels clicked against the gravel, the sound growing fainter as she disappeared between the rows of chairs. Christian remained rooted in place, his shoulders slumped as if bearing an invisible weight. The murmurs of the guests grew louder, a wave of shocked conversations washing over the ceremony space. Aiden stood alone at the altar, his chest still heaving from emotion, the damning papers clutched in his hands. The silence that followed seemed to press in from all sides, heavy with unspoken words and years of distance between father and son. The grandfather clock in the corner of Christian's study marked each heavy second with a soft tick. Moonlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rug. The room smelled of old leather and polished wood, a scent that had always reminded Aiden of his childhood visits to the estate. Christian sat in his leather armchair, his bow tie undone and hanging loose around his neck. His wedding jacket was draped over the back of the chair, and his usually perfect hair showed signs of anxious fingers running through it. Across from him, Aiden perched on the edge of an identical chair, his own disheveled appearance a stark contrast to the study's refined elegance. Between them, on the mahogany side table, sat a crystal decanter of amber scotch. Neither had reached for it. Family portraits lined the walls, generations of Delaney's watching over them in gilded frames. Aiden's eyes kept drifting to the largest one, showing his grandfather Edward in his prime, standing proud in front of this very estate. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical presence in the room. Christian cleared his throat but said nothing. His fingers drummed once, twice on the armrest. "I know what you're thinking," Aiden finally said, his voice hoarse from the day's events. "That I'm having another episode, that I'm making connections that aren't there." Christian's fingers stilled. "I wasn't thinking that." "Weren't you?" Aiden's laugh held no humor. "It's what you always think when I try to tell you something important." Aiden... "No, let me finish." Aiden leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I watched her, Dad. After Mom told me Grandpa had changed his will, I started paying attention. Vanessa was there every day, bringing him meals, arranging his medications, listening to his stories about Grandma." Christian's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "He was lonely," Aiden continued, his voice softening. "We all knew that. After Grandma died, he just withdrew. And Vanessa ... He swallowed hard. She knew exactly what he needed to hear. She'd sit with him for hours, looking at old photos, asking about the estate's history." "That sounds like kindness, not manipulation," Christian said quietly. "Does it?" Aiden reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. "I found this in his study after the funeral. It's a letter draft he never sent, addressed to someone named Elena Morrison. In it, he talks about changing his will, about making sure she would be taken care of." His hands shook slightly. "The same Elena Morrison who inherited everything." Christian's expression flickered. "That's circumstantial. Maybe. But what about this?" Aiden pulled out his phone, scrolling through files. 3 months before he died, Grandpa transferred nearly $50,000 to an offshore account. The same week, Vanessa bought a new car. Cash. The grandfather clock chimed softly, marking the hour. Christian stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the moonlit vineyard. "When I had my breakdown in college," Aiden said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you sent me to that facility and never visited. Not once." Christian's shoulders stiffened. "Mom said you were busy with work, that you were dealing with things your own way. But then, 2 months later, there you were in the society pages, dating Vanessa." Aiden's voice cracked. "Did you know she'd already been visiting Grandpa by then?" "I didn't..." Christian turned, his face shadowed. "I didn't know how to handle your situation. I thought the doctors... I needed my father." The words burst from Aiden like a dam breaking. "I needed you to tell me I wasn't crazy, that I would get through it. Instead, you disappeared into your perfect new life with her." Tears welled in Aiden's eyes, but he blinked them back furiously. And then Grandpa got sick, and everything happened so fast. The will changed, the estate was gone, and Mom... He drew a shaky breath. "Mom had to move into that tiny apartment because suddenly there was nothing left for her. Nothing left of what Grandma had wanted for us." Christian moved back to his chair, sinking into it heavily. For the first time, Aiden noticed the deep lines around his father's eyes, the slight tremor in his usually steady hands. "When I saw the engagement announcement," Aiden continued, softer now, "I couldn't let it happen, not without trying to make you see." He looked up at his father, vulnerability raw in his expression. "I know how it looked today, bursting in like that, making a scene. But Dad, I'm not having an episode. I'm not imagining things. Vanessa is Elena Morrison, and she played Grandpa just like she's been playing you." The silence that followed felt different from before, heavier with understanding, lighter with truth finally spoken. Christian stared at the untouched Scotch decanter, his reflection distorted in its crystal surface. When he finally looked up at his son, his eyes held a mix of pain and dawning recognition. "I believe you," he said softly. The words hung in the air between them, simple but profound. Aiden nodded, his chin trembling slightly as he fought back tears. They didn't move to embrace or celebrate this moment of connection. Instead, they sat in the quiet study, surrounded by their family's history, sharing their first moment of real understanding in years. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a harsh light on Christian's tired face. He sat at the marble island, still wearing yesterday's dress shirt, now wrinkled and untucked. His fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Liam, his publicist of 10 years, paced behind him in an impeccable gray suit, his dress shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. Every few seconds, his phone buzzed with new notifications, each one making Christian's shoulders tense slightly. Gina, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s, sat across from Christian, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she scrolled through her tablet. Legal documents and newspapers were spread across the island's surface like fallen autumn leaves. "Delaney wedding implodes," Christian read aloud, his voice hollow. He pushed the newspaper away and picked up another. "Son wrecks billionaire ceremony. They're having a field day with this." Liam stopped pacing and leaned against the counter. "We need to get ahead of this, Christian. The longer we wait, the more speculation builds. I've drafted 3 possible statements." "What we need," Gina interrupted, removing her glasses, "is to put an immediate legal hold on these outlets. Some of these headlines are bordering on defamation. We can't let them run wild with unsubstantiated claims." The espresso machine hummed in the background, its steady drone a counterpoint to the constant pinging of phones. Christian rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of a headache building behind his eyes. "Christian?" Liam prompted, his voice gentle but insistent. "The board is going to want a response. Investors are already calling. We need to—" "No." Christian's voice was firm despite his exhaustion. "Not yet. I need time to think." Liam exchanged a concerned look with Gina. "Time isn't exactly on our side here. The longer we wait—" "I understand the risks," Christian cut in. He stood up, his movements stiff from sitting too long. "But I won't rush into anything. Not this time." His words carried a weight that made both advisors pause. Gina closed her tablet case with a soft click. "Silence can be interpreted as guilt, Christian. Or worse, incompetence." "Then let them interpret." Christian walked to the window, watching as gardeners cleared away the last remnants of what should have been his wedding day. White chairs were being stacked, flowers removed, dreams dismantled piece by piece. Liam stepped forward, his reflection visible in the window beside Christian's. "At least let me draft a preliminary statement. Something simple, acknowledging the situation without committing to any particular narrative." Christian turned back to face them both. The morning light caught the silver in his hair, highlighting how much older he looked today. "Give me 24 hours. That's all I'm asking." After a moment of tense silence, both advisors nodded reluctantly. They gathered their things, their movements careful and measured, as if afraid any sudden motion might shatter the fragile calm in the room. As they left, Christian made his way upstairs to his bedroom. The house felt enormous now, each footstep echoing in the emptiness. He closed the door behind him, seeking refuge in the familiar space. The bed was still made. He hadn't slept in it last night, spending hours instead in his study with Aiden until dawn broke. Walking to the windows, Christian began closing the blinds one by one, wanting to shut out the world for just a few moments. The mechanical whir of each blind dropping was oddly satisfying, like counting breaths in meditation. His phone buzzed, not with another news alert, but with a call from security at the front gate. Christian's hand froze on the last blind's cord as he listened to the message. "Sir, Ms. Steele is here. She's with Diane Mercer." Christian's throat tightened. Diane Mercer was one of the most feared lawyers in Silicon Valley, known for handling high-profile divorces and settlements with ruthless efficiency. He walked to his bedroom window, which overlooked the front drive. There was Vanessa, walking up the stone steps with the same grace she'd shown walking down the aisle yesterday. She wore a cream-colored pantsuit that somehow made her look both powerful and vulnerable. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek chignon, not a strand out of place. Beside her walked Diane Mercer, carrying a leather briefcase, her reputation for devastation preceding her like a shadow. Christian's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his phone to buzz them in. He made his way downstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. In the grand foyer, he straightened his wrinkled shirt automatically, a futile gesture against Vanessa's perfection. The heavy wooden doors opened, and Vanessa stepped inside. The familiar scent of her perfume hit him first, jasmine, and something else he could never quite identify. Her face was a mask of calm, but her eyes... Christian couldn't read them anymore. Maybe he never really could. "I need to speak with you," Vanessa said, her voice carrying that same chilling calm. "Alone." Christian hesitated, his gaze flickering between Vanessa and her lawyer. Everything in him screamed that this was a mistake, that he should wait for Gina, that he should protect himself. But something else, something deeper, needed answers only Vanessa could give. He nodded slowly. The doors closed behind them with a sound like fate sealing shut. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the library's tall windows, creating pools of golden light on the polished hardwood floor. Christian's private sanctuary, with its floor-to-ceiling walnut shelves and leather-bound books, had always been his refuge. Now, it felt more like an interrogation room. Vanessa sat perfectly poised in one of the deep leather armchairs, her designer dress unwrinkled despite yesterday's chaos. Her lawyer, Diane Mercer, stood nearby like a sentinel in her charcoal suit, tablet in hand. Christian closed the heavy door behind him, the soft click echoing in the quiet room. "Thank you for seeing me," Vanessa said, her voice steady and measured. She smoothed her skirt, a gesture Christian had once found endearing. Now, he wasn't sure what to think. "Yesterday was..." Vanessa paused, choosing her words carefully. "Humiliating. For both of us. But I'm here because I care about you, Christian. And because there are things you need to know." She reached for her leather briefcase, removing a thick manila envelope. The sound of papers sliding across the mahogany coffee table between them seemed unnaturally loud. "These are documents I never wanted to share," Vanessa said softly. "I was trying to protect Aiden's privacy, but after yesterday..." She spread the papers out methodically, like dealing cards in a high-stakes game. Christian leaned forward, his eyes scanning the letterhead of the first document. Riverside Rehabilitation Center. His throat tightened. "This is Aiden's psychological evaluation from his stay there," Vanessa explained, her voice gentle but firm. "The doctors noted severe paranoid tendencies, especially regarding perceived abandonment." She slid another paper forward. "And these are his therapist's notes from the months following your divorce. The pattern of behavior is..." She sighed sympathetically. "Concerning." Christian's hands remained folded in his lap, but his knuckles had gone white. He stared at the papers, barely blinking, as Vanessa continued to build her case. "This timeline shows when Aiden was under heavy sedation during Edward's final months," she said, pointing to a detailed medical chart. "He was hardly in a state to make reliable observations about anything, let alone complex interactions." The afternoon light dimmed as clouds passed outside, casting the room in shadow. Vanessa's voice grew softer, more intimate. "Christian, I know how much you love your son, but his jealousy, his need for attention, it's not healthy. He's never accepted your happiness with anyone else." She touched a hand to her chest. "I've tried so hard to include him, to make him feel welcome, but he sees me as a threat." Diane Mercer stepped forward then, her heels clicking on the hardwood. "Mr. Delaney, while we sympathize with Aiden's emotional struggles, his public accusations are serious. Without evidence, they constitute defamation." She adjusted her glasses. "If he doesn't retract his claims, we'll have grounds for legal action." Christian sat motionless, his eyes moving from document to document. Medical evaluations, therapy notes, timeline charts. Each piece of paper seemed to weigh heavier than the last. Vanessa leaned forward, her perfume familiar and disorienting. Think about it, Christian. Who has more reason to lie? The troubled son who's always felt replaced, or the woman who's only ever wanted to love you? The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the room. Christian remained silent, his face a mask of careful neutrality, but his eyes betrayed his internal struggle. "Remember last Christmas?" Vanessa continued, her voice thick with emotion. "When I tried to include him in the family photo?" He stormed out, accused me of trying to erase his mother's memory. She shook her head sadly. "It's always been like that. Every gesture of kindness met with suspicion." Christian's gaze fell to a particular document, a psychiatric report with phrases like paranoid ideation and attachment disorder, highlighted in yellow. His jaw clenched. Vanessa gathered her things slowly, deliberately. Standing, she smoothed her dress once more. "You know how jealous your son gets," she said softly. "He just wants you all to himself." Christian didn't move, didn't speak. He stared at the fire, its flames reflecting in his eyes, as the door clicked shut behind Vanessa and her lawyer. The documentation lay spread before him like pieces of a puzzle he never wanted to solve. The setting sun painted Napa Valley in shades of amber and purple, but Aiden Delaney barely noticed the beauty from inside his parked Honda Civic. 3 blocks from his father's sprawling estate, he sat hunched over his phone, each headline hitting him like a physical blow. "Delaney wedding destroyed by troubled son," screamed the San Francisco Chronicle. "Heir or hysteric? Tech billionaire's son. Crashes wedding," declared another. The blue light from his phone screen illuminated his tired face in the growing darkness. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually neat brown hair was disheveled from running his hands through it countless times. His wrinkled dress shirt from yesterday's confrontation still clung to him, a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. "Come on, Dad," Aiden muttered, pressing his father's contact number again. The phone rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. Christian's professional voice greeted him for the 5th time that evening. "You've reached Christian Delaney. Please leave a message." Aiden's hand trembled as he ended the call. He opened his messaging app, thumbs hovering over the keyboard. What could he possibly say? The words wouldn't come. He'd already sent 3 texts. "Dad, please call me back. We need to talk. Don't let her fool you." All met with silence. The quiet in his car felt suffocating. Reaching over to the glove compartment, Aiden pulled out a half-full bottle of vodka he'd bought earlier. The seal cracked as he opened it, the sound sharp in the stillness. He took a long swallow, grimacing at the burn. His phone lit up again, another notification, another article, another reminder of his public humiliation. The comments section was worse. "Rich kid having a mental breakdown. Daddy issues much? Someone needs attention." Aiden's hands shook as he pulled up his saved voicemails. There, among the scattered messages from telemarketers and old friends, were the precious few from his grandfather. He pressed play on the oldest one, Edward's warm voice filling the car. "Hey kiddo, just checking in. Wanted to tell you how proud I am of that presentation you gave at the foundation meeting. You've got a good head on your shoulders, always have. Call me back when you can." Aiden took another drink, his throat tight. He played the next one. "Aiden, my boy. These headaches are getting worse, but hearing your voice always helps. You're the only one who really sees things clearly, kiddo. Everyone else just sees what they want to see." The vodka burned less now as Aiden continued drinking, letting his grandfather's voice wash over him. Edward had always understood him, always listened, even when Christian was too busy with his companies, his new life, his new love. As darkness settled completely over Napa Valley, Aiden started his car. The engine hummed to life, and he began driving with no destination in mind. Past the famous wineries with their perfectly manicured rows of grapes. Past restaurants filled with happy couples enjoying 5-course meals. Past everything that reminded him of the life he'd just blown up. The bottle, now nearly empty, sat in the cup holder. Cigarette smoke curled out his cracked window as he drove, the radio off, letting the silence envelope him. His grandfather's words echoed in his head. "You're the only one who really sees things clearly." But what good was seeing clearly if nobody believed you? Hours passed as Aiden circled the streets of Napa, his thoughts growing hazier. Finally, exhaustion won out. He pulled into an empty parking lot beside a cafe that had clearly been closed for months. Paper covered its windows, and a for lease sign hung crookedly in the door. Aiden killed the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy. His head spun slightly as he reclined the driver's seat, too tired to drive anymore, too numb to care where he was. The vodka bottle slipped from his loose grip, rolling onto the floor mat with a dull thud. The night air seeped through the car windows, bringing with it an autumn chill. Aiden's phone screen lit up again in the darkness. Another notification, another headline, another reminder of his failure. But his eyes were already closed, consciousness slipping away as the cold crept in around him. In the empty parking lot beside the abandoned cafe, Aiden Delaney finally found the only peace he could, in unconsciousness, away from the headlines, away from his father's silence, away from the truth nobody wanted to hear. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Shell station bathroom made Aiden's reflection look even worse than he felt. His dark hair stuck up at odd angles, and yesterday's dress shirt was wrinkled beyond salvation. The pounding in his head matched the rhythm of the bathroom's flickering bulb. He splashed cold water on his face and gripped the edges of the grimy sink. "Get it together," he muttered to himself. The events of yesterday's wedding played through his mind like a bad movie. The shocked faces, Vanessa's theatrical exit, his father's silence. His stomach churned, partly from the hangover and partly from the memory. But he couldn't give up now. Not when he was so close to proving what he knew in his gut was true. 20 minutes and 2 gas station aspirin later, Aiden pulled his Honda into a cramped parking spot behind an old brick building in downtown Napa. The sign above the independent bookstore read Valley Books and Cafe in faded gold letters. A narrow staircase led to the second floor, where a modest plaque displayed Harper Grayson, attorney at law, semi-retired. Aiden's shoes squeaked on the worn wooden steps. The hallway smelled of old books and coffee from the shop below. He paused at Harper's door, took a deep breath, and knocked. "Come in," called a familiar voice. Harper Grayson's office looked exactly as Aiden remembered from his childhood visits with his grandfather. Weathered law books lined the walls, and a large window overlooked the quiet street below. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight. Harper himself sat behind an ancient oak desk, his silver hair neatly combed, wearing a cardigan despite the warm day. "Aiden?" Harper's eyebrows rose in surprise. "My God, boy, you look terrible." "I know." Aiden ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced, but I need your help. It's about my grandfather and Vanessa Steele." Harper's expression grew serious. He gestured to the leather chair across from his desk. "Sit down before you fall down. Would you like some water?" Aiden nodded gratefully, sinking into the chair. Harper poured water from a crystal decanter, the kind Edward used to keep in his study. The similarity made Aiden's chest ache. "I saw the news," Harper said quietly, handing him the water. "About the wedding." "Then you know I made a complete fool of myself." Aiden took a long drink. "Or at least that's what everyone thinks." "What I think," Harper said carefully, "is that you wouldn't have done something so dramatic without reason. You were there, Mr. Grayson. In those last months before Grandpa died, you saw how she got close to him, how everything changed." The words tumbled out of Aiden in a rush. The will changes, the way she isolated him, how he started acting different, and now she's doing the same thing to my father. Harper leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. I remember those months well, Aiden. Your grandfather was not himself. The changes to his will were unusual, to say the least. But you signed off on them, Aiden said, unable to keep the accusation from his voice. Everything was legally sound, Harper replied. But that doesn't mean I didn't have my concerns. He paused, studying Aiden's face. There were patterns I noticed, things that made me uncomfortable. Aiden leaned forward. What kind of patterns? Harper stood slowly, walking to a filing cabinet in the corner. I started keeping notes, nothing concrete, mind you, just observations, things that didn't quite add up about Ms. Steele's background. He pulled out a thin manila folder, yellowed with age. I retired before I could pursue any official investigation. The timing of that decision wasn't entirely coincidental. Aiden's heart raced as Harper returned to his desk with the folder. What did you find? Names that changed too often. Properties that transferred hands in suspicious ways. People who seemed to vanish from her life completely. Harper tapped the folder. She's clever, Aiden. She never leaves evidence that would hold up in court, but she does leave patterns. Harper opened the folder, revealing newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and what looked like property records. 3 years ago, she went by Victoria Shore in Santa Barbara. Before that, she was Veronica Smith in Seattle. Different names, same method, getting close to wealthy older men, especially those recently widowed or vulnerable. Aiden's hands shook as he looked through the papers. This is exactly what I've been trying to prove. But why didn't you come forward before? Without concrete evidence? Harper shook his head. She would have buried me in lawsuits. And somehow, those who cross her tend to find themselves discredited rather quickly. He gave Aiden a pointed look, much like what's happening to you now. The truth of those words stung. Aiden thought of the headlines, his father's silence, Vanessa's perfectly crafted image of him as the troubled, jealous son. Start here, Harper said, pushing the folder toward him. Follow the trail, but be careful. People like her don't leave loose ends. Aiden picked up the folder, feeling its weight. Not just physical, but the weight of possibility, of vindication, of truth. Here, finally, was something real to work with, something beyond his own desperate certainty. Thank you, he said quietly, for believing me, for keeping these records. Harper's eyes were kind but serious. I believe in truth, Aiden. And I believe your grandfather would be proud of you for seeking it out. The folder felt warm in Aiden's hands, like it held not just papers but purpose, a way forward through the mess he'd made, a chance to prove he wasn't crazy or jealous or broken. He was just right. The dim light of the motel room cast long shadows across the worn carpet as Aiden spread Harper's folder across the bed. The Starlight Motel wasn't much. Peeling wallpaper, a rattling air conditioner, and a mattress that had seen better days. But it was cheap and close to Harper's office. That's all he needed right now. Aiden pulled out his laptop and opened a fresh page in his spiral notebook. The springs creaked as he settled onto the bed, surrounding himself with papers. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the first document, a newspaper clipping from 2015 about a charity fundraiser. In the photo, a woman who looked remarkably like Vanessa smiled next to elderly donors, but the name in the caption read, Victoria Sanders. Okay, he muttered, jotting down notes. Victoria Sanders, 2015. For hours, he worked methodically through databases and social media searches. Each lead seemed promising at first, then dissolved into nothing. Victoria Sanders disappeared completely after 2016. Another alias, Veronica Smith, appeared in Phoenix around the same time, then vanished just as quickly. The morning sun had given way to afternoon when Aiden started making calls. His voice grew hoarser with each attempt. "Hi, I'm researching a story about Victoria Sanders and her work with the Henderson Foundation." Click. "Hello, I'm trying to reach anyone who might have known Veronica Smith." "Wrong number. My name is Aiden, and I'm looking into some charitable work done by..." "Please don't call again." By evening, his notebook was filled with dead ends and crossed-out leads. His head throbbed. The walls of the small room seemed to close in around him. He needed air. The night air was cool against his face as he walked aimlessly down the street. A small coffee shop, the Daily Grind, glowed invitingly through steamed windows. Inside, the smell of coffee and the soft murmur of conversation helped clear his head. Settling into a corner booth with his laptop and an Americano, Aiden continued scrolling through archived web pages. His eyes were starting to blur when something caught his attention. A deleted article from a financial watchdog blog. The photo was grainy, clearly taken at some kind of business function. Vanessa stood next to a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, both holding champagne glasses. Aiden leaned closer to the screen, his heart racing. The caption identified the man as Graham Lunsford, former vice president of Pacific Coast Banking. He quickly Googled the name, finding only old business articles from before 2017. After that, nothing. It was as if Graham Lunsford had simply disappeared. "Come on," Aiden whispered, digging deeper. He remembered something from Harper's notes about a connection to banking. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he searched for any connection between Graham and Vanessa's known aliases. An hour later, he had an address for Paul Martinez, a former private investigator who might know something about Graham. It was nearly 9 p.m. when Aiden knocked on the door of a small house on the outskirts of town. Paul answered, a weathered man in his 50s, wearing reading glasses and a faded t-shirt. His expression was guarded. "Yeah? Mr. Martinez? I'm Aiden Delaney. I need to ask you about Graham Lunsford." Paul's face changed subtly. After a long moment, he stepped aside. "Come in, but make it quick." Inside, Paul's living room was cluttered with books and old case files. He gestured for Aiden to sit while he remained standing, arms crossed. "I dated Caroline Weber back in 2017, Paul said without preamble. "She worked with Graham at Pacific Coast. That's how I know about your soon-to-be stepmother." Aiden's pulse quickened. "What happened to Graham?" Paul's expression darkened. "Your Vanessa, or whatever name she was using then. She got close to him. Real close. Graham was lonely after his wife died. Vulnerable. Within months, he was making unusual transfers, breaking protocols. When the irregularities were discovered, Graham took the fall. Lost everything. His job, his reputation, his home. And Vanessa vanished, like she always does." Paul shook his head. "Graham had a breakdown. Disappeared himself after that. Last I heard through the grapevine, he's dying of cancer somewhere up north. Calistoga, maybe. Living off the grid." Aiden scribbled frantically in his notebook. "Do you think he'd talk to me? If you can find him?" "Maybe. He's got nothing left to lose now." Paul's eyes narrowed. "But be careful, kid. People who cross her tend to regret it." Back in his motel room, Aiden spread a map of Northern California across the bed. His hand shook slightly as he circled Calistoga with a red pen. The small town was nestled in the mountains, perfect for someone wanting to disappear. "You're my last shot, Graham," he whispered, staring at the circled town. He began gathering his few belongings, shoving them into his backpack. He'd head north at first light, his last chance to prove what Vanessa really was, before she could sink her claws any deeper into his father's life. The morning fog hung thick and heavy over the winding roads of Calistoga. Aiden's hands gripped the steering wheel as he followed the hastily scribbled directions from Paul, each turn taking him deeper into the secluded hills. The rental car's GPS had given up miles ago, leaving him to rely on old-fashioned navigation. road names and landmarks jotted on a crumpled notepad. "Third dirt road past the abandoned gas station," he muttered to himself, squinting through the mist. The car's tires crunched on gravel as he made the turn. The narrow road stretched before him, bordered by dry fields and gnarled oak trees. After what felt like an eternity of bumps and sharp turns, a weathered farmhouse emerged from the fog. Paint peeled from its wooden siding, and the front porch sagged slightly, but someone clearly lived there. An old pickup truck sat in the overgrown driveway, its blue paint faded to a ghostly gray. Aiden's heart skipped when he saw the figure on the porch, an elderly man sitting in a wooden rocking chair, wrapped in a thick sweater despite the mild morning. As Aiden parked and stepped out of the car, the man's body shook with deep, rattling coughs. He pressed a handkerchief to his mouth, waiting for the fit to pass. This was Graham Lunsford, the same face from the photos, but aged dramatically. His once powerful frame had withered, and his carefully groomed appearance had given way to several days' worth of stubble and uncombed gray hair. Aiden approached slowly, gravel crunching under his feet. Graham watched him with wary eyes but didn't move from his chair. "Mr. Lunsford?" Aiden's voice came out steadier than he felt. "I'm Aiden Delaney." Graham's expression remained guarded. "Private property," he said, his voice rough from coughing. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not interested." "I'm not selling anything," Aiden said. He took a deep breath. "I'm here about Vanessa Steele." The change in Graham's face was immediate and dramatic. His jaw tightened, and something dark flickered behind his eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied Aiden with an intensity that made him want to step back. Finally, Graham pushed himself up from the rocking chair. "Come inside," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We shouldn't talk out here." The interior of the farmhouse matched its exterior, worn but lived in. Stacks of books covered most surfaces, and the furniture looked like it had been collected from various thrift stores over the years. The air smelled of coffee and cigarettes. Graham gestured to a faded armchair while he lowered himself onto a worn leather couch. His hands shook as he pulled out a pack of cigarettes and lit one, the flame from the lighter dancing erratically. "How do you know that name?" Graham asked, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "She's engaged to my father," Aiden said, "or was, until I stopped the wedding 3 days ago." Graham's eyebrows rose slightly. He took another long drag from his cigarette before speaking. "Smart move, kid, though I'm guessing she didn't take that well." "No," Aiden agreed, "but I know what she is. I just can't prove it yet." Graham's laugh turned into another coughing fit. When it passed, he stubbed out his cigarette and immediately lit another. "What she is," he repeated softly. "Yeah, I learned that lesson the hard way." "Will you tell me about it?" Aiden asked, pulling out his phone. "Everything you remember?" Graham stared at the phone for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Why not? Not like I've got much left to lose." He settled back into the couch. "I met her in 2017, except she wasn't Vanessa then. She called herself Leah Morgan." The story came out slowly at first, then faster as Graham seemed to find his rhythm. He described how Leah had appeared at his bank one day, all charm and vulnerability, how she'd sought his advice on investment opportunities, always finding reasons to extend their meetings into lunch or dinner. "I was lonely," Graham admitted, his voice thick with shame. "My wife had died the year before. Leah, she knew exactly how to play that. She'd share her own stories of loss, show up with homemade meals, call late at night just to talk. Before I knew it, I was in love." He described how their relationship progressed quickly, how Leah had exciting connections to a promising tech startup, how she'd convinced him they could build something together. All she needed was capital to secure their position before the company went public. $500,000, Graham said, lighting his third cigarette. "My life savings, plus some creative accounting at the bank. She had all the paperwork, all the right answers. I thought I was too smart to get conned. His laugh was bitter. Turns out I was just another mark. Aiden leaned forward. What happened? What always happens. One day she was gone. Phone disconnected, email bouncing back, address empty. The startup was fake, the paperwork forged. By the time I realized what had happened, he shrugged. Well, you can see where I ended up. Did you go to the police? Of course, but there was nothing to trace. Every document led nowhere. Every witness disappeared. And who would believe it? A respected banker claiming he was seduced into giving away his money? I'd have lost my license, faced criminal charges myself. So I resigned, sold everything, and disappeared. Graham's cough returned, worse this time. When it passed, he looked at Aiden's phone. You want to record this, don't you? Aiden nodded. If you're willing, it might be the only way to stop her. Graham was quiet for a long moment, then straightened in his chair. Do it. Aiden set up his phone and pressed record. Graham spoke clearly despite his occasional coughs, recounting dates, amounts, and details. He described Vanessa's methods, how she mixed truth with lies, how she used emotional manipulation to cloud judgment, how she always had an answer for every question. She's not just a liar, Graham concluded, his voice growing hoarse. She's a predator. She studies her targets, learns their weaknesses, then moves in for the kill. And she's good at it. Too good to get caught. Until now, maybe. Aiden stopped the recording. Graham slumped back in his chair, exhausted from the effort of telling his story. His eyes met Aiden's with sudden intensity. If you can stop her from doing it again, do it. Burn her mask down. Aiden nodded, clutching the phone tightly. Finally, he had proof. Real, concrete evidence of who Vanessa really was. Later that evening, the neon sign of the Pine Creek Inn flickered against Aiden's window as he sat cross-legged on the worn floral bedspread. His laptop cast a blue glow across his tired face, while his fingers moved methodically over the keyboard, making sure Graham's testimony was safely backed up in 3 different places. He couldn't risk losing this evidence, not when he finally had something concrete to show his father. The small room felt both confining and oddly comforting, with its dated wallpaper and the soft hum of an old heating unit. Aiden hit play on the video again, Graham's weathered face filling the screen. The old banker's voice cracked as he detailed how Leah, Vanessa, had wormed her way into his life, using carefully crafted vulnerability to gain his trust. She knew exactly what to say, Graham's recorded voice rasped. Made me feel like I was saving her, protecting her. But she was calculating every move. Aiden's throat tightened as he watched. The parallels to his grandfather's situation were undeniable. The same tactics, the same manufactured helplessness, the same slow erosion of boundaries until the victim felt completely dependent on her presence. He paused the video, rubbing his tired eyes. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders. This wasn't just about exposing Vanessa anymore. It was about preventing history from repeating itself. His father needed to see this, needed to understand the pattern before it was too late. Opening his email, Aiden's fingers hovered over the keyboard. How do you tell your father that the woman he almost married is a professional con artist? How do you bridge years of distance and hurt to deliver such devastating truth? He started typing, deleted everything, then started again. Dad, I know things between us have been broken for a long time. I know you probably think I'm just trying to sabotage your happiness. But please, just watch this video. The man speaking is Graham Lunsford, a former banker who knew Vanessa when she was living under a different name. What he describes, it's exactly what happened with Grandpa. I'm not asking you to take my word for it anymore. Just listen to Graham's story. Then, if you're willing, I'd like to meet just you and me. No lawyers, no PR team, no Vanessa. Just father and son, talking honestly for the first time in years. He attached the video file and added a secure link to the backup. His cursor lingered over the send button for several long moments before he finally clicked it. The soft whoosh of the sent email seemed to echo in the quiet room. Aiden got up and paced the small space between the bed and the window. Outside, a few cars passed on the highway, their headlights cutting through the darkness. He checked his phone. No messages, no missed calls. The silence felt heavy with anticipation. Back at his laptop, he played the video again. Graham's words had become familiar now, like a painful but necessary mantra. She's patient. She works slowly. By the time you realize what's happening, she's already got her hooks in so deep you can't see straight anymore. Aiden's mind wandered to his father, proud, successful Christian Delaney, who had built an empire but couldn't see the predator right in front of him. How many nights had Vanessa spent carefully constructing her web around him? How many subtle manipulations had she employed to isolate him from his son? Sleep proved elusive that night. Aiden lay on top of the covers, still fully dressed, watching the video one more time, then again. Each viewing revealed new details. The way Graham's hands shook when he described discovering the theft. The hollow look in his eyes when he admitted how completely he'd been fooled. Around 3 a.m., Aiden found himself writing notes in his phone. Show Dad the timeline. Point out similar patterns with Grandpa. Stay calm, no accusations. Listen more than talk. The night stretched on, minutes crawling by like hours. Aiden alternated between anxious pacing and sitting perfectly still, trying to imagine every possible way the conversation with his father could go. Would Christian be defensive? Angry? Would he finally see the truth? Or would Vanessa's influence prove too strong? Dawn began to creep through the thin curtains, painting the room in pale gray light. Aiden's eyes burned with exhaustion, but his mind wouldn't quiet. This video was his last chance to reach his father, to break through years of distance and misunderstanding. It had to work. He checked his email compulsively every few minutes, waiting for any response. The morning grew brighter, traffic on the highway picked up, and still nothing. Aiden forced himself to shower and change clothes, trying to prepare himself for another day of uncertainty. At 9:07 a.m., his phone buzzed. A new email from Christian Delaney. Aiden's heart hammered as he opened it. Come to the estate, noon, no one else. 7 words. No mention of the video, no indication of his father's reaction. Just a simple command that could mean anything. Aiden read it over and over, searching for clues in the brief message. His hands trembled slightly as he set the phone down. He closed his laptop slowly, carefully, like handling something that might shatter. The video was out there now, in his father's possession. The truth he'd fought so hard to uncover was finally going to be heard. Whether it would be enough to break through years of emotional walls and careful manipulation remained to be seen. Aiden began gathering his things, packing his laptop and notes with methodical precision. In 3 hours, he would face his father again, this time armed with more than just suspicions and desperate pleas. He had evidence, testimony, proof. He had Graham's raw, honest account of Vanessa's true nature. Looking around the small motel room one last time, Aiden took a deep breath. The message from his father glowed on his phone screen. Come to the estate. Noon. No one else. It was time to face whatever came next. The autumn breeze rustled through the manicured hedges as Aiden's car approached the estate's rear gate. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, heart thundering in his chest. The security guard, a man he'd known since childhood, simply nodded and pressed the button to open the gate. No words needed. The crunch of gravel under his tires seemed unnaturally loud in the strange stillness that had settled over the property. Usually, the estate bustled with activity. Gardeners tending to the pristine landscaping, housekeepers moving efficiently between tasks, his father's various assistants hurrying about with tablets and phones. Now, there was nothing. Just empty paths and perfectly trimmed hedges, standing like silent sentinels. Aiden parked in the circular drive, taking a moment to steady his breathing. His phone felt heavy in his pocket, weighted with Graham's testimony. Through the windshield, he could see his father's study window, the same room where they'd sat together just days ago when everything started unraveling. The walk to the front door seemed to take forever. Each step on the familiar stone path brought back memories, running here as a child, storming out as a teenager, leaving in defeat after his breakdown in college. Now here he was again, hoping desperately that this time would be different. The massive oak door opened before he could knock. Christian stood there in dark jeans and a gray cashmere sweater, so different from his usual tailored suits. The casual clothes made him look older somehow, more vulnerable. His eyes were rimmed with red, deep shadows beneath them suggesting sleepless nights. His expression gave nothing away. "Come in," Christian said quietly, stepping aside. Aiden followed his father through the foyer and into the study. The room smelled of leather and old books, just as it always had. Late morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Everything looked exactly the same as it had days ago, yet everything felt completely different. Christian settled into his usual leather armchair near the unlit fireplace. Aiden took the seat across from him, the coffee table between them like a neutral zone. Neither spoke for a long moment. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking each second of silence. Without preamble, Aiden pulled out his phone. His fingers trembled slightly as he pulled up the video and propped the device on the coffee table where both could see it clearly. He pressed play, and Graham's weathered face filled the screen. The study fell completely silent, except for Graham's raspy voice describing his encounter with Leah, Vanessa's previous identity. Christian didn't move, didn't blink, as Graham detailed the careful manipulation, the slow-building trust, the masterful way she had isolated him from friends and family. When Graham described how she had convinced him to liquidate his savings, Christian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sunlight crept across the floor as the video played on. Graham's testimony was raw, honest, devastating in its simplicity. He described the aftermath of Vanessa's betrayal, the shame that kept him from going to the police, the depression that followed, the way she had calculated everything to leave him with no recourse. Christian watched it all without a word, his expression frozen in place. When Graham's final words faded, "She's not just a liar, she's a predator," the silence that followed felt deafening. Aiden's heart pounded as he watched his father stare into the cold fireplace, processing what he'd just seen. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. He could see the muscles working in Christian's jaw, could practically hear the gears turning in his mind as he compared Graham's story to his own experience with Vanessa. Finally, Aiden couldn't stand the silence anymore. He leaned forward, his voice low but urgent. "She did it before. She's doing it again." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Dad, you're not crazy to have doubted her, but you'd be crazy to ignore this now." Christian remained still, his eyes fixed on the empty hearth. The grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm, marking the heavy moments between them. Aiden waited, hardly daring to breathe, hoping desperately that the truth had finally broken through. His father's face showed no anger, no denial, but also no clear acceptance. He sat perfectly still, like a statue, as if moving might force him to acknowledge the reality of what he'd just witnessed. The silence stretched on until it became almost unbearable. Finally, Christian stirred slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need time to think." Aiden felt something inside him deflate and expand simultaneously. Disappointment that his father hadn't immediately seen the light, but hope in the fact that he wasn't dismissing the evidence outright. He nodded once, already rising from his chair. "Okay," he said simply, understanding that pushing harder now would only make things worse. He walked to the study door, each step measured and deliberate. Outside, the sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the estate's immaculate grounds. Aiden left without looking back, knowing that sometimes the hardest truths needed time to settle in. The motel room's dim lighting cast long shadows across the worn carpet as Aiden sat on the edge of his bed, his phone resting beside him like a ticking bomb. He'd ordered a sandwich from the deli down the street, but it lay untouched on the nightstand, wrapped in white paper that crinkled occasionally in the breeze from the old air conditioner. Every few minutes he checked his phone. No messages, no missed calls, no response from his father after showing him the damning video of Graham's testimony. The silence felt heavier with each passing hour. Aiden paced the small room, his footsteps creating a path between the window and door. The sun had long since set, leaving only the yellow glow of street lamps filtering through thin curtains. He'd rehearsed this moment so many times in his head, finding proof, showing his father, finally being believed. But the reality was different. The quiet aftermath felt worse than any confrontation. He switched on the TV for background noise but quickly muted it when an entertainment news segment showed photos from the failed wedding. Even days later, they were still running the story. Aiden's face appeared briefly on screen, a grainy shot of him storming down the aisle. He clicked the TV off. The night stretched endlessly. Aiden lay on top of the covers, fully dressed, checking his phone every few minutes until his eyes grew heavy. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the occasional sound of cars passing on the street below. Morning light was just beginning to creep through the curtains when a sharp notification ping jolted Aiden awake. He fumbled for his phone, heart racing, but it wasn't a message from his father. Instead, a news alert lit up his screen. His stomach dropped as he read the headline. Exclusive. Christian Delaney and Vanessa Steele, seen dining at private Napa hotel. Engagement rumors resurface. No, Aiden whispered, his voice cracking. No, no, no. With trembling fingers, he opened the article. There it was, a paparazzi photo taken through what looked like a restaurant window. His father and Vanessa sat close together at an intimate table, both smiling. They looked happy, comfortable, as if the wedding disaster had never happened, as if Graham's testimony didn't exist. Aiden scrolled through the article, each word hitting him like a physical blow. An unnamed source was quoted. They're working through things. The connection was never broken. The phone slipped from his grasp onto the bedspread. Aiden's chest felt tight, like he couldn't get enough air. After everything, the research, finding Graham, getting actual proof of Vanessa's manipulative past, his father had still chosen her. Again. He stumbled to his feet, the room spinning slightly. The bathroom light flickered as he switched it on, harsh fluorescent bulbs illuminating his pale reflection in the mirror. Dark circles under his eyes, hair disheveled from restless sleep. He looked as broken as he felt. The anger came suddenly, rising up like bile in his throat. All those years of being dismissed, of watching his father choose other people, other priorities. The months spent trying to protect him from Vanessa's manipulation. The careful gathering of evidence, all of it meant nothing. Aiden's fist connected with the mirror before he even realized he was moving. The glass splintered with a sharp crack, creating a spiderweb of fractures across his reflection. Pain bloomed across his knuckles, hot and immediate. His legs gave out. Aiden slid down the bathroom wall until he hit the cold tile floor, cradling his bleeding hand against his chest. Blood dripped between his fingers, bright red against the white floor. He chose her, Aiden whispered, his voice breaking. Again. The words hung in the air of the small bathroom, mixing with the steady drip of blood and the distant hum of early morning traffic. In the fractured mirror, a dozen broken reflections of Aiden stared back at him, each one showing the same raw hurt in his eyes. The shattered mirror reflected Aiden's face in fractured pieces, each shard showing a different angle of his pain. Blood dripped steadily from his knuckles onto the white porcelain sink, bright red drops that seemed too vivid against the sterile surface. His hand throbbed, but the physical pain felt distant, almost welcome compared to the crushing weight in his chest. With trembling fingers, he grabbed a thin white towel from the rack and wrapped it around his bleeding hand. The cotton quickly bloomed with red spots, but Aiden barely noticed. His eyes remained fixed on his broken reflection, seeing but not really seeing. How could he? The words came out as a whisper, barely audible over the humming fluorescent light. The bathroom suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in. Aiden stumbled back into the motel room, his legs unsteady beneath him. His phone lay on the rumpled bed sheets where he'd dropped it earlier. The screen still showed that damned article, Christian and Vanessa, looking cozy at some exclusive restaurant. Their smiles felt like a knife twisting in his gut. With his good hand, Aiden grabbed the phone and pulled up his father's number. The call went straight to voicemail, Christian's professional greeting feeling like another slap in the face. Aiden ended the call without leaving a message and opened his text messages instead. How could you? He typed the words with shaking fingers, hitting send before he could second-guess himself. The message showed as delivered, but no response came. No typing indicator appeared. Just silence. Something snapped inside Aiden then. The numbness gave way to white-hot rage that surged through his body like electricity. He snatched his car keys from the dresser, not bothering to grab anything else. The motel door slammed behind him as he stormed to his car. The drive to the estate passed in a blur. Aiden's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his injured knuckles screamed in protest, but he barely felt it. His mind raced with all the things he wanted to say to his father, each thought more bitter than the last. The estate's iron gates came into view, looking as imposing as ever against the late morning sky. Aiden pulled up to the security station and jabbed the intercom button repeatedly with his unwrapped hand, leaving small smears of blood on the chrome surface. The security guard's voice crackled through the speaker, hesitant and uncertain. "Mr. Delaney?" "Let me in," Aiden demanded, his voice raw with emotion. "Now." There was a long pause, followed by hushed voices Aiden couldn't quite make out. Finally, the gates began to swing open with a mechanical whir. Aiden didn't wait for them to fully open before gunning the engine and driving through. He parked haphazardly in the circular driveway, tires crunching on the pristine gravel. The grand house loomed before him, all stone and glass and old money. Aiden remembered playing hide-and-seek in these gardens as a child, back when things were simpler, back before Vanessa. His feet carried him up the stone steps to the massive front door. Blood pounded in his ears as he raised his fist to knock, but before his hand could make contact, the door swung open. Vanessa stood in the doorway, the picture of casual elegance in a cream-colored silk blouse and tailored pants. She held a crystal wine glass filled with deep red liquid, her manicured fingers wrapped delicately around the stem. Her lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What are you doing here, Aiden?" Her voice was honey-sweet, dripping with false concern. She took a small sip of wine, watching him over the rim of her glass. "Where's my father?" Aiden's voice came out rough, barely controlled. His injured hand throbbed in time with his racing heart. Vanessa's eyes flicked to his bloody towel-wrapped hand, then back to his face. Her smile widened slightly. "Christian is resting. He's not to be disturbed." "Like hell he is," Aiden spat. "Get out of my way." "I'm afraid I can't do that." Vanessa's voice hardened slightly, though her pleasant expression never wavered. "Your father needs time to recover from your recent dramatic performances. He doesn't want to see you right now." "That's not your decision to make." Aiden took a step forward, but Vanessa didn't budge from the doorway. "Actually, it is." She took another casual sip of wine. "This is my home too, after all. or it will be very soon. The implication hit Aiden like a physical blow. He shook his head, desperation creeping into his voice. No, I showed him proof. I showed him what you really are. And yet here I am, Vanessa replied softly, her eyes glittering with triumph. While you're out there, bleeding all over our lovely stone steps. Aiden's vision blurred with angry tears. I'm not leaving until I talk to my father. Vanessa sighed dramatically, as if dealing with a petulant child. She set her wine glass down on a nearby table and pulled her phone from her pocket. Her fingers moved efficiently across the screen as she dialed. Yes, she spoke into the phone, her eyes never leaving Aiden's face. I need someone removed from the property. Trespassing. Movement caught Aiden's eye. He looked up to see Christian standing on the upstairs landing, clearly visible through the soaring foyer windows. Their eyes met for a brief moment, but Christian's face remained impassive, unreadable. Without a word, his father turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the house. Aiden stood frozen, the betrayal stealing his breath. In the distance, police lights began to flash at the estate gates, red and blue cutting through the morning sun. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Aiden's wrists as two police officers guided him down the estate's grand stone steps. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, and dew still clung to the perfectly trimmed hedges. His childhood home had never felt more foreign, more hostile. Above, Christian stood motionless on the balcony, his silhouette dark against the pale morning sky. He didn't speak, didn't move, just watched as his only son was led away like a common criminal. Aiden's wrapped hand throbbed, each pulse a reminder of his shattered reflection in the motel bathroom. "We have to process you, sir," one of the officers said quietly, almost apologetically. His touch was gentle as he helped Aiden into the back of the patrol car. The leather seat was cold and sticky against Aiden's skin. Through the window, he caught one last glimpse of his father's rigid form before the car pulled away. The estate grew smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared completely, swallowed by the winding road and morning mist. At the police station, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Aiden was fingerprinted and photographed. The booking officer's questions came in a monotone rhythm. Name? Date of birth? Address? Each answer felt like another piece of his dignity falling away. They led him to a holding cell, a cramped space with gray concrete walls and a single metal bench. The door clanged shut behind him, the sound echoing through the empty corridor. Aiden sank onto the bench, his bandaged hand cradled in his lap. A duty nurse visited shortly after, her movements efficient but kind as she unwrapped his makeshift bandage. She cleaned the cuts with antiseptic that stung, but Aiden barely flinched. Physical pain felt distant compared to the hollow ache in his chest. "These will heal," she said simply, securing fresh gauze around his knuckles. She didn't ask how it happened, and Aiden was grateful for her silence. Hours crawled by in that gray cell. Aiden leaned his head against the cool concrete wall, closing his eyes. Every memory played on repeat in his mind. The wedding interruption, Graham's testimony, the paparazzi photos of Christian and Vanessa, his father's silence on the balcony. Each time he'd trusted, each time he'd hoped, and each time Christian had chosen someone else. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. An officer appeared at the cell door, keys jingling. "Mr. Delaney," the officer said, "you're being released. No formal charges will be filed, just a warning this time." He paused, then added, "Your father's legal team has handled everything." The words landed like stones in Aiden's stomach. Even this, his arrest, his release, was just another mess for Christian to sweep under the rug, another inconvenience to be managed by his army of lawyers. They returned his belongings in a paper bag: wallet, keys, phone, watch. Each item felt heavier than before, weighted with new meaning. The phone showed several missed calls from unknown numbers, probably reporters already catching wind of the story. The station's automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, releasing Aiden into the gray dawn. The parking lot stretched before him, empty except for a few police cruisers. He stood there, suddenly uncertain. His car was still at the estate. He had no destination in mind, no plan beyond the desperate confrontation that had led him here. A sleek black car purred into the lot, its tinted windows reflecting the dim morning light. It pulled up beside him, and the passenger window rolled down with an electric hum. Behind the wheel sat a woman he hadn't seen in months. Perfectly styled hair, sharp cheekbones, and blood-red lipstick that hadn't changed since his childhood. Margot Delaney, his mother, fixed him with her icy gaze. "Get in," she said, her voice carrying the same steel edge he remembered. Margot Delaney picks up Aiden from the police station in her pristine black Mercedes. The silence between them is familiar, comfortable in its own restrained way. At a boutique hotel in Napa, Margot orchestrates Aiden's recovery with her usual precision. Fresh clothes, hot coffee, a room with a vineyard view. Over breakfast, Aiden tells her everything. Vanessa, the wedding disaster, Christian's silence. Margot listens, composed but deadly focused. "She's better than I expected," she says, "but not better than me." With her resolve hardened, she quietly announces she'll visit Christian that night. At the estate, Vanessa lounges contentedly, basking in media praise, until Margot arrives unannounced. In her tailored black suit and quiet fury, she calmly dismantles Vanessa's carefully curated lies. Dates don't line up. Stories contradict. Bank records raise questions. Christian enters mid-confrontation, shocked at Margot's presence. But slowly, realization dawns. As Margot exits with surgical grace, she leaves Christian with one final thought. "It's your move." That night, Christian appears at Aiden's hotel, rain-soaked and vulnerable. His usual polish stripped away, he admits his failures, his pride, blindness, and Vanessa's illusion of love. "I see you now," he tells Aiden. After years of hurt, Aiden finally hears what he's waited for. They embrace, both breaking down, walls of resentment melting in the quiet storm outside. Weeks later, the estate is calm. Aiden and Christian fall into a peaceful routine. Coffee on the patio, quiet companionship. The ghosts have begun to fade. In Edward's old study, Aiden finds a forgotten box of family mementos and a photo. Young Aiden, Margot, and Edward, radiant and happy. He frames it and leaves it on Christian's desk. Christian finds the photo at dusk, touched. When Aiden appears in the doorway, Christian says gently, "Let's try again, son." They sit together by the window as the sun sets over the vineyard. Father and son. Not perfect, but finally healing. If you enjoyed the story of Aiken, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.